Hello everyone and welcome. In today's video we're going to be talking about two things. The first is going to be the High Middle Ages, which is the last 200 years of the medieval time. And the second is going to be the Avignon Papacy, where for about 70 years the Pope never set foot in Rome. Now, before I go forward and talk about some of the hallmarks of Christendom in the High Middle Ages, I want to point out that one of the dangers in looking at church history is that we overemphasize the church as an institution. As we saw at the beginning of this year, the church is more than just an institution. It is five things simultaneously at once. It is an institution, but it's also a sacrament, and a servant, and a herald, and a mystical communion. And so the danger is, as we're looking at all these crazy things that happen in church history, from the Papal States to the Crusades, to this and that, we tend to only look at the church as the institution. But it's helpful to remind ourselves that the church is more than just the popes and bishops. While they are an extremely important part of the church that gives us a visible structure, they are not the totality of the church, because the church as a whole is an organism, not an organization. So let's talk about the Mendicant Orders. So by the time the Mendicant Orders come around in the 12th century, everyone's starting to realize that there needs to be some reform within the church. As we saw in the last video, a bunch of bishops and even popes are essentially political puppets, and there's a lot of greed and simony and nepotism happening within the church. And so the church as an institution alone was becoming absurdly wealthy. It was becoming so political. Popes and emperors were fighting. This is not what the church originally was, right? If you look at the church in the Middle Ages, it's very different than what it was like in the early church. Because in the early church, you could be killed at any moment for being a Christian, whereas in the High Middle Ages, the church was the powerhouse and cultural background of all of Europe. But as we saw, popes, bishops, and even monasteries are starting to be corrupted by wealth. And so along comes the Mendicant Orders. Right? Anytime that there is trouble in the church, God always sends saints. So two people who respond to God's call to sainthood are Saint Francis and Saint Dominic. Right? They start the Franciscan and the Dominican orders. And what's really unique about the Mendicant Orders is they don't have a monastery or really a place that is called home. Francis was born into an extremely rich Italian family in the town of Assisi and was a huge partier until one day he essentially gets a 2x4 of grace upside the head, and God tells Francis to rebuild his church. And so Francis rebuilds this broken down church nearby, and then realizes God wasn't talking about a little c church, was he? He was talking about the uppercase C. And so Francis starts the Franciscan order, and after getting permission from the Pope to do so, goes and spends the rest of his life traveling around and begging. And the Franciscan order emphasizes poverty and charity. Whereas many monasteries, popes, and bishops at this time were hoarding wealth, as well as all the political figures, Francis was going around and giving literally everything away. It is said that he refused to touch money for the last half of his life, and anytime he would come upon a beggar who was wearing a worse cloak than him, he would switch with the beggar. Right? Francis always wanted to be the poorest of the poor. And so the rest of his life, he lived in marketplaces, he preached, and he begged. And what's crazy is this movement exploded. Right? To this day, there are Franciscan monks around the world. One of my friend's uncles was a Franciscan friar. And as you can see, Franciscans emphasize poverty, and so everything he owned fit into a shoebox. And so anytime he got a new pair of shoes, the family would always joke, Father, I see that you got a new suitcase there. On the other hand, you had the Dominicans, who were the same as the Franciscans in that they emphasized poverty and charity, but they also added an emphasis on education. And so while they were beggars, they were extremely well-educated beggars who went around and preached. And so while the institution has corruptions, you can see from the grassroots of the church, from the individual members, there are still saints coming about and transforming the church from within. Now, another really important contribution that the Catholic Church makes to the world in the medieval times is the university system. How many of you want to go to college? Thank the Catholic Church for creating the university system, because the modern university system was started in the Middle Ages by the Catholic Church. And schools such as Oxford and the University of Paris were started by the Catholic Church actually as cathedral schools meant to teach priests how to become better priests. Because as we saw in the last video, a bunch of priests are poorly trained, and so the church starts investing in education so priests can learn how to properly shepherd their people. And as time goes on, they start to allow lay people to enter into these universities as well, and these universities explode. Now, one of the common fallacies that we as a modern people hold is that everybody in the past were less educated than we are today. All right, and as a culture, that may be true, because as a culture, we have just so much knowledge that couldn't even have been conceived of in the Middle Ages. The only reason we have that knowledge is we're standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before us. Because in reality, it's really hard to come up with a new idea.
Okay, Mr. Essay, I say, prepare to be written! I'm doing it! I'm doing it! Yeah! Yeah! Some of these, and some of them. Now let's see how it looks so far. The break time!
It's really hard to find things out. I mean, think about coronavirus, for example. We want there to be a vaccine and a cure for it, but it's not easy just to figure something out. You can't just throw a ton of money at something and suddenly it's solved. Money helps, for sure, but it sometimes just takes a genius and dumb luck to come up with new ideas. And so all the information that we have today, we're just really lucky that we've been born in this time period. But if you still think that people in the medieval times were uneducated, I want you to consider what it took to become a, quote, beginner in the education system of the Middle Ages. To become a beginner, one had to master the following subjects: math, geometry, astronomy, music, grammar, logic, rhetoric, philosophy, natural philosophy, which we call science, Latin, Greek, and memorize the majority of the Bible. And all of this had to have been done by the age 20, and you usually started at age 14. Nerd! So in 6 years, you were an expert in all of these fields, and then in the university system, you were considered a beginner. I think they were fairly educated in the medieval times, and I don't think that I could pass those standards. Now, another thing to note on the universities is up until the university system started, learning primarily happened in monasteries. But with universities starting off of cathedrals to train priests, learning is now moving from the monastery into the city. And some really important things that come out of the university system is, first, you have this finalization of the integration of faith and reason. Now, do not read that as faith and reason were enemies before this point. If you look back at the early church, a significant portion of the church fathers were philosophers before they were Christians. So faith and reason has always been friends, but the university system finalizes this. And it's interesting because Aristotle, a philosopher, was used as much as the Bible in the university system. And so reason and faith were not seen as enemies. Rather, they were seen properly as complementary figures. And secondly, you see an increase of lay education. Lastly, the university system in the Middle Ages used what was known as the scholastic method. So if you were a medieval student, you would show up to class and the professor would walk in the door, and that day you would answer one question. The professor would ask a question and you had to give yes or no. If you answered yes or no to the question, you immediately had to come up with every possible objection to your personal position. In years past, we actually practiced this in class where I always brought forward the question, do animals go to heaven? And as I'm sure many of you would answer yes, but if you were in the scholastic method of learning, you immediately had to find every single reason that animals do not go to heaven. Conversely, if you hate animals, you would then have to come up with all the reasons that animals do go to heaven. And you could not affirm your answer until you had refuted every single objection possible. So maybe be glad that you weren't in my class this year. Right, essentially, the scholastic position was you don't know your argument until you know all the reasons you might be wrong. This is a brilliant way to do education because a lot of times we say, I believe this and I think it's true, and then they close their minds off. The medieval world was one where it says, okay, this is what I believe to be true. I'm going to prove myself wrong. And if I can't prove myself wrong, then it might actually be true. The scholastic method of learning is really scary because it makes you deal with the fact that you might be wrong and you actually have to encounter opposing viewpoints. The really cool thing with the scholastic method is if you can shoot down all counter viewpoints to your own, you know pretty much for certain that your position is right. And if you find out that your position is wrong, even better, because if someone is truly wise, the greatest gift that anybody can give them is showing them that they're wrong and giving them an opportunity to change. It is better to know you're wrong than to live in ignorance. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is the Avignon Papacy, which happens from 309 to 377. And the gist of the Avignon Papacy is that the French king gifts this town of Avignon to the Papal States, and the Pope moves his papal residence to Avignon, and he stays there for over 70 years. Now, we may be thinking, why did he do this? Well, here's why. The benefits of moving the papacy to Avignon are first, its central location within Europe. After the Eastern Schism, as you can see on this map from the Great Schism, Rome is no longer the center of the Catholic Latin-speaking world. Instead, it is now on the fringes, whereas Avignon is now in the center of Europe. Second, this was a land owned by the papacy because it was a gift from the French king. And France at this time was really the only stable nation in Europe. Rome itself was a terrible place to live, constantly being invaded by Muslim invaders, and just like it had really fallen apart. It was gross to live there. You didn't want to live in Rome in the medieval times. Don't do it. It's bad for you. And so the Pope lives in Avignon. But there's quite a few problems with the Pope being in Avignon. The first is very simple. The Pope is a bishop. And where's he the bishop of? Rome. Right? If you're the bishop of Rome, if you're the shepherd of the Romans, you should be living in Rome. Just like we probably hope that the mayor of Salt Lake lives in Salt Lake rather than living in LA. It seems absurd that a person who lives in LA their whole life should be making decisions for us here in Salt Lake. And so in that same sense, the Pope should be living in Rome because he is the bishop of Rome. Second, you see this breaks tradition and apostolicity because the Pope is the successor of St. Peter, who was the first bishop in Rome. So again, the Pope should be in Rome. Another really major problem that happens with the Avignon Papacy is there are 7 different popes in Avignon, and all of them happen to be French. I think one of them was even the nephew of the French king, and almost all of the cardinals elected by the Pope at the time happened to be French. The papacy is starting to look really, really French, and non-French Catholics are starting to feel excluded. And this would be like if the president had moved the White House to Iowa,
Oh yeah, one of the most popular attractions is the butter cow sculpture.
And then 7 straight presidents were Iowan.
From the earth I rise, and to the earth I one day will return.
And all new Congress members from around the U.S. happened to be Iowan as well.
Hey, is this heaven? No, it's Iowa.
The rest of the country would probably start to take issue with this. And the rest of the country would be wrong, because Iowa's incredible. And so non-French Catholics are taking issue with this. And once again, God calls on a normal person to become a saint to help rebuild his church. In this case, you have St. Catherine of Siena, who, for 3 straight summers, goes to Avignon, urging him to return to Rome. Right? Many people attribute the Pope returning to Rome to St. Catherine of Siena. And here are 2 of her letters to the Pope. And notice what she's saying. She says, I long to see you the sort of true gentle shepherd who takes an example from the shepherd Christ, whose place you hold. He laid down his life for his little sheep in spite of our ingratitude. So take a lesson from the true father and shepherd. For you see that now is the time to give your life for the little sheep who have left the flock. St. Catherine of Siena is calling the Pope out and saying, look, you're supposed to be the representative of Christ for the world. You're not acting like it. Be like Christ and lay down your life for your sheep. Right? Return to Rome even if you don't want to. And then she says, I have prayed and shall pray, sweet and good Jesus, that he free you from all servile fear, and that holy fear alone remain. May ardor of charity be in you in such wise as shall prevent you from hearing the voice of incarnate demons. She's actually talking about the cardinals there. And heeding the counsel of perverse counselors, the French counselors, settled in self-love, who, as I understand, want to alarm you so as to prevent your return, saying, you will die up, Father, like a man, for I tell you, you have no need to fear. Right? So she's pushing him, saying, return to Rome. And so Pope Gregory is afraid to return to Rome because he is old and he thinks that he'll get sick and die because Rome is such a dirty city. And because travel is very difficult and taxing in this time period. But at the urging of St. Catherine of Siena, he realizes my place is in Rome with my sheep. My job as the Pope is not to do what I want, it is to do what God needs. And so he returns to Rome. And he gets sick and he dies. But the good news is the papacy returns to Rome. But the death of Gregory IX sets off one of the biggest embarrassments of the medieval Catholic Church, which is what I'm going to be talking about on Monday with the Great Western Schism. This will be my last video of this week. Make sure to be ready for the quiz on Friday. Otherwise, I hope you all are enjoying a bit of sunshine outside because the days are getting beautiful. So stay healthy and stay holy, everyone.